The story begins with a collision between two vast worlds of power and imagination. The Persian and Greek spheres touched and carved into one another like tectonic plates, and nothing remained quite the same afterward. Within 3 generations that followed the first confrontations, entire ways of thinking about governance and culture were challenged. The consequences were not immediate or singular, but cumulative and unpredictable across generations. To understand the Persian-Greek interactions, we must return to the 5th century BCE and earlier. The Achaemenid Persian Empire expanded rapidly, absorbing diverse peoples and stretching toward the Aegean shores like a machine of imperial administration. Across the sea, Greek city. States remained politically fragmented, but culturally inventive, producing art, philosophy, and martial institutions that would meet Persia on competitive terms. That contrast made the encounters unpredictable and historically consequential. The Ionian cities on the Asian shore were the first zone of direct collision between Persian power and Greek identity. Persian expansion absorbed those Greek settlements and created friction through taxation, appointment of tyrants, and cultural impositions. That pressure prompted resistance in the Ionian Revolt, which in turn pulled mainland Greek polities into a conflict that would ignite larger wars. The revolt showed how local grievances could cascade into continental confrontation when imperial ambition met seafaring city-state solidarity. From the Ionian fires came the Persian Wars, a sequence of campaigns that would become foundational stories for both sides. These wars included Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea, and each carried symbolic weight beyond immediate military outcomes. Victory and defeat were translated into myths, poetry, and political projects that lasted for centuries. The wars hardened identities and produced narratives about freedom, tyranny, and civilization that still shape our modern imaginations. Marathon became a symbol of citizen, army resistance against imperial overreach, and the Athenians turned a military success into cultural momentum. The victory empowered Athens to pursue naval dominance and to invest in monumental building projects and civic institutions. This expansion was not isolated from the Persian threat, but was partly a reaction to it. The fear and respect generated by Persian power stimulated Greek political creativity and imperial ambition in Athens. Thermopylae and Salamis revealed a different logic where geography and naval skill could check land-based imperial might. The Spartan led resistance at Thermopylae, elevated sacrifice and strategic delay into a legendary moral tale, which resonated across Greek culture. At sea, Athenian triremes and superior naval tactics at Salamis turned Persian logistical advantage into vulnerability. Those moments underscored how military technology, environment, and political will interact under pressure, reshaping subsequent strategic thinking. The wars did not simply produce binary winners and losers, because they also created space for ongoing interaction and exchange. Even at times of conflict, trade and diplomacy found ways to thread through the violence and maintain channels of communication. Merchants continued to move goods, envoys continued to offer negotiations, and cultural items continued their slow migrations across borders. War and contact became paradoxically entangled, enabling a flow of ideas that would prove decisive in the long run. Cultural exchange after the wars accelerated in subtle and visible ways, producing a hybrid vocabulary of art, dress, and ideas. Greek artists adopted Eastern motifs like palmettes and griffins, while Persian craftsmen borrowed metallic techniques and figural representation styles. These adoptions did not erase origins, but they created a shared aesthetic language across the Aegean and Anatolia. That visual conversation foreshadowed deeper intellectual and institutional exchanges that would unfold across decades. The exchange worked both directions because Persian elites admired many Greek intellectual achievements and sought them for status and utility. Greek physicians, sculptors, and engineers found lucrative positions at Persian courts and in frontier cities. Mercenaries and intellectuals traveled across borders, and their movement facilitated cross-cultural conversations that were practical as well as aesthetic. Those human bridges mattered more for long-term cultural synthesis than any single battle could accomplish. Economics underwrote much of the contact between Persia and Greece since trade networks connected the Aegean to the Persian highway systems. The royal road and maritime arteries funneled goods, silver, grain, and luxury items across enormous distances each year. Greek city-states depended on access to Eastern raw materials and markets, while Persian administrators valued Greek craftsmanship and maritime services. Trade created mutual dependencies that tempered ideological hostility and created incentives for diplomacy. Diplomacy adapted to the realities of mutual interest, and envoys became regular fixtures despite ideological differences. Envoys, marriage alliances, and negotiated truces allowed both sides to manage conflict without constant annihilation. These diplomatic practices established a template for later Hellenistic and Persian interactions, showing how imperial centers could coexist through negotiation and shared norms. In many ways, diplomacy wrote the unwritten rules that smoothed frontier contact. Art and architecture became arenas where influence was most visible and persistent, generating styles that historians later call the Orientalizing and subsequent hybrid periods. Greek temples show Eastern floral motifs, while Persian palaces incorporate figural narrative scenes. These stylistic borrowings signaled admiration as much as imitation, and they permitted elites on both sides to show cosmopolitan taste. Over time, these shared aesthetics reinforced social bonds that outlasted immediate political turmoil. The movement of people accelerated technological and administrative cross-fertilization between the two civilizations. Persian administrative efficiency, including record-keeping and taxation, fascinated some Greek observers who encountered organized imperial governance. Conversely, Greek notions of citizenship and civic participation provided counterpoints that inspired debate among subject peoples. These exchanges did not produce wholesale adoption, but they seeded new approaches to statecraft and social organization. Military practices migrated across borders too, with Persians learning naval tactics and Greeks learning from Persian cavalry and archery methods. In the decades following the wars, hybrid armies emerged that combined strengths from both traditions. These tactical exchanges were practical responses to battlefield realities rather than ideological statements. The result was a new military ecology where adaptability mattered more than purity of tradition. Religion and myth moved quietly through contact, sometimes merging motifs and sometimes remaining discrete in local practice. Greek mythographers mentioned Persian customs and Persian records adapted stories that reflected foreign gods and practices. These encounters produced syncretic cults and localized religious festivals that borrowed ritual elements freely. Religious exchange mattered because belief systems shaped civic identity and provided moral frameworks for daily life. Economic elites on both sides exploited cross-cultural opportunities and became brokers of change through patronage and trade networks. Merchants and bankers created credit networks that spanned the Aegean and Persian provinces, smoothing transactions across vast space. Their financial activities supported artistic patronage, diplomatic gifts, and the movement of experts across borders. Behind every courtly exchange lay a web of private interests that made sustained contact profitable and durable. Language contact increased over centuries, creating pockets of bilingualism in trading hubs and administrative centers. Merchants, mercenaries, and middlemen often used Greek or Persian as linguae francae in specific contexts, facilitating transactions and negotiations. This linguistic flexibility enabled the transfer of ideas, legal concepts, and literary motifs across cultures. Words carried concepts as well as goods, and those linguistic transfers shaped intellectual life in surprising ways. The later Persian appreciation for Greek art and thought intensified after the wars, especially as mercenaries and intellectuals moved between courts. Greek rhetoricians, sculptors, and physicians found patrons among Persian satraps and nobility. These exchanges presaged the deeper Hellenization that followed Alexander, but they were meaningful in their own right. Greek cultural capital, therefore, circulated long before any political conquest reshaped the map. Persian influence on Greek material culture also runs deeper than most popular accounts, suggest visible in clothing, jewelry, and courtly manners. Wealthy Greeks adopted Persian dress elements as signs of prestige and exotic sophistication. These fashion choices reflected admiration and practical adaptation to climate and trade connections. Material culture became a language of identity where borrowing signaled status and cosmopolitanism. Trade in luxury goods like silk, spices, and precious metals linked elite consumption across the region and created a taste for foreign objects. These goods acted as carriers of ideas and motifs as much as raw materials. Collectors and elites used imported objects to craft a visible identity of power and reach. Through display and ritual use, foreign goods anchored new social meanings within both Persian and Greek elite cultures. The intellectual exchanges were more fragile but equally important, with philosophy, science, and historiography moving along the same routes as traders. Greek natural philosophers and Persian scholars found points of contact in astronomical observation and medicine. These conversations were not always systematic, but they added comparative perspectives that enriched both traditions. Knowledge traveled in fragments and was recombined in ways that seeded later developments across the Mediterranean and Near East. Military alliances and shifting loyalties created a political landscape where identity and interest intersected unpredictably. City-states sometimes sided with Persia against rival Greeks, leveraging imperial power for local advantage. This opportunism complicated simplistic narratives that paint Greeks as uniformly anti-Persian. Understanding those choices reveals how pragmatic politics shaped alliances more than abstract ideologies did. The legacy of Persian-Greek interactions endures in institutional and cultural forms that outlived both empires. Hellenistic kingdoms blended Persian administrative practices with Greek civic institutions, creating hybrid governance models across Asia. Artistic motifs and religious syncretism persisted in sculpture, coinage, and temple architecture. For centuries, the encounter transformed, layered, and complicated the historical trajectories of both peoples in enduring ways. Why should we care about these ancient interactions in a modern world of different borders and technologies? Because the Persian-Greek story shows how conflict and contact co-produce cultural change and institutional innovation. It demonstrates that warfare does not erase exchange, and that empires create networks that outlast political violence. In our own globalized age, those lessons about reciprocity and entanglement remain unexpectedly relevant. The philosophical twist is that hostility can catalyze curiosity, and curiosity can reshape hostility into something else. Persian-Greek interactions show how fear and fascination often travel together and produce hybrid outcomes. That hybridization reframes our view of ancient identity as porous and negotiated, rather than fixed and hermetic. The past becomes a mirror that reveals how contact transforms cultures over time. Specific stories within this larger narrative still surprise historians and enthusiasts alike, from individual mercenaries who changed loyalties to craftsmen who reinvented motifs. Those human-scale anecdotes illuminate broader structural patterns of borrowing and adaptation. By following these lives, we see how macro forces manifest in personal choices and creative compromises. That human dimension is the most compelling reason to keep studying these intersections. Archaeological finds continue to complicate the story by revealing objects that mix Greek and Persian features in everyday contexts. Pottery shards, coins, and small votive offerings show cross-cultural blending at the grassroots level. Those artifacts help us reconstruct networks of exchange and practice that written sources often obscure. Material culture brings into focus the ordinary interactions that sustained long-term coexistence and creativity. The historiographical lesson is that ancient actors understood their worlds in fluid categories and frequently borrowed foreign practices for pragmatic reasons. Nationalist retellings obscure this complexity and produce myths rather than nuanced histories. Reclaiming the messy reality of contact helps us appreciate how cultural identities form through exchange and contest. It humbles simplistic narratives and invites a more sophisticated understanding of the past. The transformation after Persian-Greek contact set the stage for later global encounters by creating models for imperial rule and cultural diplomacy. These ancient dynamics can be read as early chapters in a longer story about globalization. When empires interact, they create durable institutions and symbolic vocabularies that travel beyond their political lifespans. That continuity resonates in the way regional hubs later connected Europe and Asia through commerce and ideas. In the end, the Persian-Greek interactions teach us about resilience and adaptation, about the necessity of translating difference into workable relationships. Both civilizations emerged altered by contact, each borrowing and resisting in equal measure. The result is a richer, more complicated history than victory or defeat alone can tell. That complexity is the enduring gift of their encounter to anyone willing to look closely. If we look at modern political and cultural exchanges through this ancient lens, we see patterns repeating in different guises and technologies. The interplay between conflict and exchange remains a persistent feature of how societies evolve. Recognizing those patterns helps us navigate present-day interactions with more humility and imagination. The past offers both cautionary tales and examples of creative synthesis, when contact is sustained rather than annihilating. Our final reflection returns to identity and memory, because these are the realms most shaped by cultural contact and historical narrative. Persia and Greece both invested their victories and defeats with moral significance, which then shaped their self-images. Those narratives have been mobilized across centuries for various political projects, but they are more flexible than they appear. Learning to read them critically reveals how past interactions continue to inform modern identities. The story we have traced is not finished, because archaeology and scholarship keep revealing new chapters. Each discovery rewrites small parts of the narrative and invites fresh interpretations of contact and consequence. Our historical imagination must remain open to revision, especially when evidence challenges comforting myths that humility is the historian's most valuable discipline in the face of complex intercultural history. So what does the Persian-Greek encounter ultimately teach us about the human past and present? It reminds us that cultures are porous, that power compels contact, and that exchange often outlasts outrage. Wars can redraft borders and loyalties, but exchanges in art, trade, and ideas produce durable transformations. If this gave you a new perspective on ancient interactions, consider subscribing for more historical narratives.